Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, Fanny Price. Thinking about the heroine, Fanny Price, continuation number 2. Maybe useful in considering Fanny just simply to pose to ourselves a number of discussion topics and questions. And I'm going to begin this video with 3 or 4 questions. And I think it's worthwhile mulling them over. I will discuss these questions in the course of this video, but it's also worth mulling them over, for ourselves. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I think that interpretations of literature should be quite broad, and I think that they should be quite personal. And unless a novel really is able to speak to us as individuals and help us to develop our critical faculties and how we think about ourselves and how we think about our own world, I'm not sure of the great usefulness of it. I don't think that great literature is merely about escapism. It should have a purpose as well. It should speak to the eternal, the unchanging, the elemental aspects of our nature as human beings, which we can recognise in one another from era to era, from aeon to aeon. And so I think just simply considering questions, asking ourselves questions, and not being afraid to come up with ideas which might be negative about what it is that we're reading is useful. So the questions that we're going to discuss in this video, or that I'm going to discuss in this video, are how have Fanny's education and her upbringing been different from those around her? So I think it's important to consider both education and upbringing. So what the knowledge that has been disseminated to Fanny, education, but also the way of life that has been imbibed by Fanny, her upbringing in her family home at Portsmouth. And a lot of that we are left as the reader merely to glean from the things, the criticisms that her cousins have of Fanny when she arrives at Mansfield Park, and also the difficulties that Fanny experiences in trying to fit in with the world there. And the types of criticisms, I think, that Mrs. Norris lays into her with. Mrs. Norris begins at a point of fact or a point of accuracy with regard to Fanny and expands negatively and viciously into those traits or characteristics that Fanny has. So we have to, in many respects, act as detectives in the early part of the novel to understand what Fanny's early upbringing was. However, as we come deeper into the book, we actually experience her home in Portsmouth at one point. And also in rereading the book, we can bring the knowledge that we have of the home at Portsmouth to bear upon Fanny's behaviour and conduct, especially in the early chapters of the novel. So how have her early education and upbringing affected her? How have they rendered her different from the people that she finds herself amongst? And how will this affect her? So in Fanny's instance, she's got as well the other aspect of that she is an outsider. Even if she'd come from a background that was really comparable with that of the Bertrams, then she would have been an outsider. But here in this novel, there are more factors than that. She's both an outsider and a different social level. So how do both of these things affect her, and how does she cope with them? Is the judgment that we as reader bring to bear on this that she copes poorly? Or do we think as a reader that she copes remarkably well? So if we think that Jane Austen is aiming at realism in her characterisation and depiction of individuals in her novels, then is there anything intrinsically more or less valid in choosing character such as Fanny to represent a heroine, as opposed to choosing a more exuberant, a more immediately attractive character as the heroine. If, as I mentioned in the second video on Fanny, we accept that people like Fanny exist and that their happiness and their fulfillment is as important as anybody else's, then to depict that in a novel is really quite valid. And we need to look for the dramatic interest really in the surrounding characters and in the surrounding situations. And in many respects, this is what Mansfield Park does. The novel is not about an individual, as we might say Emma is about an individual. And it's not about concepts such as Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, albeit that they're illustrated through very lively love affairs. Perhaps the topic of this novel is really Mansfield Park and how a collective group of people can bring happiness towards someone or unhappiness towards someone, depending on how they behave. So, as I say, Fanny is the characterization of a woman, and Jane Austen, in many respects, is asking for acceptance of that type of woman. And in showing the acceptance or rejection that the people around her display towards Fanny, as I say, the drama comes through the society of Mansfield Park and also the interest and the intellectual perspectives and intellectual engagements that the reader have with the novel are as much shared with the whole of the cast of the novel as they are with the heroine. It's a different approach to the writing of the novel. One thing that it's important to think about in Fanny's characterization is her age. It's really very relevant to Fanny's characterization. She is very young when we meet her, so only 9. And we follow her as she grows up. So in some ways, as the reader, we see more of Fanny's foibles and Fanny's weaknesses as she goes through the struggles, the tussles of maturing, with which most people will have been familiar, or who are familiar, depending on our age. And I think as well, of all the heroines in Jane Austen's novels, that Fanny is actually closest psychologically to the age that she's given. So a lot of the heroines in Jane Austen's novels seem to have more sophistication than really goes with the age group. Or in the case of Anne Elliot, in fact Anne is described as being 26, and yet her mindset is a lot more like a woman who's still single in her 30s, I think, especially, given the characterization that the whole period setting. But Fanny is really her age, and I think especially she's her age against the mental bullying that she has gone on suffering for years and years and years. And of course it's recognised and acknowledged today by psychologists that people who undergo a lot of mental and psychological bullying as they grow up will find it difficult to mature mentally and psychologically as quickly as other people. And so if Fanny seems young for her age, again, over and above what I've just been saying, or even by comparison with Jane Austen's other heroines, there's also a realism replete within this, because although psychology was not developed at this time, Jane Austen's capacity to observe and to understand the psyche is really highly developed, highly sophisticated, hugely insightful. And as well, part of this is that Fanny is not old enough and she's not mature enough to have grown out yet of many of the effects of her upbringing. So given time, many of the anomalies that are created in people by disadvantageous upbringings or disadvantageous circumstances as they're growing up can become neutralised as they proceed through life and they bring their own individual intellect to bear on what happens to them. But that hasn't happened yet for Fanny because she's just simply not old enough. And as I say, if she does seem a little bit behind for her age, which is only 18 at the end of the novel, then I think still understandably we can see that as attributable to her early years.